generation that invented the modern chef. I've subtitled it a comically quick summary because I'm going to do about 125 years in 17 to 20 minutes. But it's really just to sort of contextualize the talk we're about to do with Norman Van Aken and Mike Beltran. And it's sort of, just to be a little more specific, it's really about the chef culture in the West, and more specifically in the United States. And something I always like to mention, because I only learned about it myself several years ago, but we tend to think largely about restaurant history in terms of French history, European history, and then that culture spreading out. There's actually a very rich history that predates all of that by hundreds of years that includes a whole, what we would now call celebrity chef culture in certain parts of Asia. And it's worth, I can't even begin to talk about it right now, but it's something more people should know about, and it definitely deserves a little Googling, and you'll find some fascinating things. Just a totally, in the West, unacknowledged, forgotten history. So I just like to mention that. So this is where I'm going to start. Prior to the 20th century, and I should say everything I'm saying is a slight overgeneralization because things happen in different places at a different pace, and this was especially true before we had things like the internet, social media. Ideas took longer to get around, and very often the same sorts of things were happening in different places, and sometimes those places weren't necessarily places or people that were being written about and documented. So this is all very general, but in those terms, the whole idea of a chef that we would even know the name of really didn't become something until the mid-20th century, with very few exceptions. One of them was Auguste Escoffier. Restaurants originally in France and in other places in Europe were basically businesses of convenience, right? You were a worker in Paris, you had a lunch break, you needed food, you might go to what they call the table d'hôte, and it was one seating, one menu, you paid in advance, it would be something like maybe a stew, right? Purely functional. Or you'd be at an inn, you're on the road, you need something to eat, they'd sell you whatever, something along the same lines. That was the origins of all of this. Eventually a cuisine starts to develop, and as many people in this room I'm sure know, Auguste Escoffier with his Guide Culinaire codified a lot of what we would call haute cuisine or classical French recipes, some of which he devised himself, many of which he didn't. And he himself, this rarely gets discussed, but we would, if they had the term back then, maybe it would have only applied to him, but we would have definitely talked about him as a celebrity chef. He had a real sense of marketing. He actually sold bottled sauces in the early 20th century. One of them was a sauce Robert, and some of those made their way even to the United States. But he was, like I say, one of very few people whose names would even be known. He also was partners for a time with César Ritz, who was a very famous hotelier, and that also helped forward his name. But largely through the first half of the 20th century, if you were at a restaurant in France or if you were at a French restaurant in the United States, essentially you were eating the same menu. It might be different selections of things, but they were all kind of pulling from Escoffier's Guide Culinaire, right? This classical cuisine might be different things at different times. The American chef Larry Forgione, who had American Place and other restaurants in the 80s, tells this story that one day as American cuisine was taking off, he went around to like 5 or 6 French restaurants in New York, asked for a copy of the menu, took them home, laid them out, and like across those 6 restaurants, there were maybe only 20 dishes that were represented, right? Because there were so many dupes. Whereas he and his contemporaries were kind of starting to come up with their own things. And then this starts to change. I'm not going to, again, for reasons of time, get into it. But there's a movement called Nouvelle Cuisine, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. That was slightly predated by Chef Fernand Plante, La Pyramide Restaurant. Some of you may know about the fact that a number of kind of future titans of Nouvelle Cuisine actually apprenticed to Fernand Point, including Paul Bocuse, most famously. And all of those influences started to come together in the mid-60s and early 70s. It wasn't given a name until 1973, but this is what we now call Nouvelle Cuisine. And Nouvelle Cuisine was, it was named by Go and Milot, these two French journalists. They put forth the 10 Commandments of Nouvelle Cuisine, but it was basically a lot of the things we all now assume about chefs. So they were devising their own dishes. They were starting to plate things in a much more graphic, some people might say artistic, style. They were also starting to become known quantities. This is when we first had chefs who people weren't necessarily thinking of it as a strictly blue-collar profession. They were thinking of it as, oh, this is a way you might get famous. Maybe you could do very well for yourself. Paul Bocuse is the gentleman on the far left, no longer with us, but he was kind of widely considered the ringmaster. But this was a group of dozens of chefs, some more well-known than others. And they also had just an amazing marketing savvy. I mean, I look at this photograph, and you would never have seen anything like this prior to these days. And we start to have what we call signature dishes, right? Now, that's a term we all know. Almost every chef whose name we know probably has at least one. This was the famous VGE soup that Bocuse came up with in 1975 for a dinner for the French president. It's still served at his flagship restaurant today. And people have done plays on it at restaurants all over the world. And all of these things, right? The idea of a chef as a creative force, the idea of cooking as something personal and expressive, the idea of becoming a chef might mean becoming famous, you know, and maybe you could actually do quite well for yourself. This kind of starts to come over to the United States, right? And in the mid to late 70s, it really kind of reached a critical mass. So this is, obviously, this is a very different time. There's no internet. There really wasn't coverage of chefs on television. And this is an issue of Newsweek magazine that if you talk to people who were cooking or thinking about cooking in the US, this is actually, if you can believe it, a very famous issue of Newsweek magazine. And it doesn't just talk about the Nouvelle Cuisine movement, but it also talks about what we would now call foodies popping up around the United States, you know, and shops like Williams-Sonoma were starting to take off. And this is another thing this is an amazing common reference point for people of that era. The Great Chefs of France was a book by two British journalists, Anthony Blake and Quentin Crew, and it profiled and had beautiful photographs of all of the 3-star Michelin chefs at the time outside of Paris. So people in the French countryside, like Alain Chapelle, for example, or Bocuse and Verger, right, these folks. But again, this is kind of how word got around. And there are chefs, David Kinch slept with this book on his nightstand. You know, he could tell you the chefs, there were menus and kitchen diagrams in addition to the profiles. And this, again, became kind of a North Star to a lot of young Americans. I should also point out there was a book about the great women chefs of France. Why those need to be separated, I don't know. But this was a book that, like, if you talk to somebody like Mary Sue Milliken, this was something that was very important to her. Okay, so these are this is the original core kitchen team of Michael's Santa Monica, which opened in 1979. It wasn't the first new American restaurant, but it was a very intentionally done restaurant. This photograph, it's my favorite chef photograph of all time. I know it's Ruth Reisel's favorite photograph of all time, but this was a very deliberate idea of chefs as a rock band, right? And this, you know, putting out there for Americans, the food on the menu was using ingredients you would not see used in French restaurants, even in the US. You know, it was kind of it was maybe at that time you would say maybe a Nouvelle American style. But I go back to this photo, right? And then I mean, they're obviously influenced by their French predecessors. Again, it's always separate, but this is Mary Sue Milliken and Susan Feniger, another photograph I love from the early 80s when they had City Restaurant in Los Angeles. And then we started to have these people who were kind of really trying to move the movement along and connect people who were part of this growing chef community in the United States. One of them was James Beard, writer and television personality, among other pursuits. And of course, Julia Child, right? There were shows that Julia Child did with chefs. A lot of chefs, you know, you could go back 25 years, a lot of chefs who watched her television show in the 60s, The French Chef, started to percolate the idea of, oh, maybe I want to cook, right? She was really important in making the idea of cooking in a serious way accessible to all these young kids who, for the most part, you know, really hadn't eaten particularly well, they hadn't traveled particularly well. And every generation seems to have them, right? But this became one of the core group of people that you saw in a lot of articles and charity events and whatnot. On the far left is Paul Prudhomme from New Orleans, who did a lot for Creole and Cajun food. That's Larry Forgione, who I just mentioned, who really made an exploration of a regional American cuisine. That is Jonathan Waxman, the third from the left. And then Jimmy Schmidt, who was from the Midwest. Of course, that's Alice Waters from Chez Panisse. And Bradley Ogden, also from the Midwest. But each of these people, much like the French predecessors, was putting forth sort of their own culinary style. They were riffing on different regions, different types of cuisine. And this is almost exactly 10 years after that Newsweek cover, right? So the Newsweek cover was all about France. This merited a Time magazine cover, right? That American food is a thing, okay? Probably unimaginable much before this, but much the way that earlier article did, this one really sort of announced, this is what's going on, these are the key people doing it, these are the commonalities we see around the country, et cetera. And this brings me to, we have the great Norman Van Aken in the audience. Norman Van Aken, Emeril Lagasse, and of course the late Charlie Trotter, trio of friends. They referred to themselves actually as the Triangle because of where they were located geographically. You know, three key players in this movement that I'm describing, right, that helped really bring American cuisine into its own. I have to say also, Norman was one of the first American chefs to do what we would now call like a chef cookbook. This is an amazing book. Norman's also, this isn't just, I'd say this if you weren't here, Norman, but Norman's also one of the rare chefs who's also an excellent writer. And this was a very important book that if you can get your hands on it, I recommend it. And then this is, of course, Michael Beltran, who Norman was Mike's, where's Mike? There he is. But you know, it's funny because if you were here earlier when I was speaking with Marcus Samuelson, we talked about how, you know, I think the most exciting thing that's been going on in American food for a while now is people sort of exploring their own heritage, right? And not necessarily just exploring a region that, you know, that appeals to them or just doing their take on certain French food, but really going deep on their own personal and familial heritage. And I think that you know, Norman and Mike are going to be great to have a conversation with about this because, again, Mike did train with Norman, and also I think they are great representatives of these two consecutive eras, the way I see it, and also two great people to talk about the evolution of Miami cuisine.